Students, in this part of the video, we are going to learn about the types of vectors. In previous class, I explained you what is a vector and what is a scalar. Again, I repeat, a vector is a physical quantity which has both magnitude and direction, and it has to obey the triangular law of vector addition. We will learn about this triangular law later, but here take it as a vector which has both magnitude and direction. Okay, I mean a physical quantity is said to be a vector if it has both magnitude and direction, and we are going to learn, already I told you, about the types of vectors. If you watch the board, I listed around 10 vectors. Actually we have so many, but these things are very important. The first one, I said it is a parallel. The second is the equal. The third is antiparallel. Fourth is a zero vector or null vector we call, and collinear, coplanar, orthogonal, axial, polar and unit. These are the types of vectors. First we start with the parallel. Parallel vectors, you know that we can represent a vector by its magnitude and as well as the direction. Let's say a vector. This vector has a magnitude. The length of the vector is known as its magnitude, and this arrowhead is showing the direction. Let's name this vector as A bar. We are talking about the parallel vectors now. And we have one more vector. Okay, it is the B vector. If we arrange these two vectors in this way, we call them as the parallel vector. Here they appears to be moving along the same line, and if you watch it carefully, the angle between the two vectors is 0. When a vector is called as the parallel, simple, the angle between the two vectors is equal to 0, we call it as the parallel vector. And you have to remember that any two vectors can be parallel. There is no need of having the same magnitude. Okay, if you watch it carefully, here in this one, vector A, the magnitude of the vector A is greater than the magnitude of the vector B. These two are parallel to each other. I hope you understood. The two vectors are said to be parallel if the angle between the two is 0. Okay, and the condition is they should not be same, but the directions must be same. Then we come across with the second, what I said, equal vectors. It is just extension of this. Let's say it is a vector A bar. Okay, and we got one more, is the B bar. These two vectors are said to be equal vectors, and they are also the parallel vectors. They are not only equal, they are also parallel. In this condition we can write vector A is equal to vector B. Here in equal vectors, not only the angle between them is 0, but also their magnitudes and directions are same. And we come across with parallel and as well as the equal. Then after we have to think about the anti-parallel. And let's say it's a vector. We named it as A bar, and I drew one more vector, and you know that these vectors are said to be anti-parallel. What does it mean? The angle between the two is equal to how much? 180 degree. As you know that if I put a vector here, the A vector, and I transpose this, and I put it here. Okay, the angle between the two is 180. Okay, if the angle between the two vectors is equal to 180, then we call those vectors are antiparallel. There is no need of equality between them. That means one may have more magnitude compared to the other. We completed that. It is the third part of first, it is the antiparallel. Okay, then we have to learn about the fourth vector. Okay, the fourth vector, what I said, zero vector. What is a zero vector? A vector whose magnitude is zero. That means what? The starting point of the vector is equal to negative point. The starting point of the vector is negative point. For example, you say it is velocity. I mean the vector, velocity vector. If it is written as a zero vector, that means what? Velocity is zero. In the same way, acceleration must also be zero. Then we call it as the what? Zero vector. Now students, we are talking about the zero vector, or we call it as the null vector. It's simple. Zero vector whose magnitude is equal to 0. The magnitude of the vector is equal to 0 is known as the zero vector, but it has the direction, and also the direction of the vector is arbitrary. That means whatever it may be, the direction is. We will learn these zero vectors when we are studying about the uniform motion. I mean, when the velocity is constant and as well as the acceleration is equal to 0. That is known as the zero vector. Then after, that means what? The velocity is constant and acceleration is 0 and direction arbitrary. Direction is arbitrary. Okay. Then after, we talk about the collinear vectors. If you watch the board carefully, you will find all these vectors are collinear. Linear means what? Along the straight line. Okay. These vectors are said to be the collinear vectors. Then after, we have to know about the coplanar, the vectors which are in the same plane. If we say it is a vector 1 and we have one more vector, these two vectors can be said as what? Coplanar vectors. Additional to that, I am adding one more. Is the vector A, is a vector B, and it is vector C. These vectors are said to be what? Coplanar. Then after, we have to know one more vector. It is number 7, orthogonal vectors. If the two vectors or three vectors are perpendicular to each other, it is extension of that. If the angle between them is 90 degree, we call them as orthogonal. I hope you understood. If the angle between the three vectors, let's say A, it is the B, and it is the C, then we call those vectors are what? Orthogonal. Then after is very important one. We are talking about the axial vectors. What is the axial vector? You have to understand. For example, you say it is a circular path. Okay? And we took an axis. Okay? A particle is moving in the circular path. Here, such things comes when we learn about the circular motion. It has the radius of r, okay, and it is the direction of linear velocity, okay, and it is the axis of rotation. The angular velocity acts along the axis of rotation. In this case, the angular displacement, here the particle is moving from here to here, just imagine, it made an angle. Okay, here theta is an axial vector. We are talking about the 8. And also this velocity, angular velocity, is the axial vector. And also the angular acceleration will act in the same direction, but the axis is not fixed here. Such vectors, angular displacement, angular velocity, and angular acceleration are the axial vectors. Then after, what left? Polar. Here the same thing. If you take this one, in this axis is fixed. If the axis is fixed, we call it as the polar vector. Understanding me? If the axis is fixed, then we call it as the polar. And finally, we have to know about the unit vector. In the previous video, I explained you the vector which has unit magnitude is known as the unit vector. Okay, let's talk about it somewhat detailedly. I hope you understood that. These are the parallel. If you keep this vector in opposite direction, and it is called as antiparallel. Know that. And if the two vectors have equal magnitude and same direction, and we call them as the equal vectors. And here I told you what is the zero vector and other vectors. The important things what you have to remember is the axial vector, polar vector, orthogonal, coplanar, and as well as the collinear. These three things have their own value while you are learning physics, and also you have to remember these two. What is the axial vector and polar vector? And finally, unit vector always is with you. It is always with you. Whenever you are doing vector or vector algebra, it always follow you. I hope you understood the types of vectors very well. If you feel it is good to watch the video, then subscribe my channel to get the videos, new videos continuously.